I just want to thank you for joining us today. My name is Samantha Hooker, and I'll be the moderator for today's Eval Cafe. As you may know, the cafe is a longstanding speaker series hosted by the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan. The goal of the series is to take a deeper dive into all things evaluation. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestral land of the Three Fires Confederacy, recognizing that WMU is located on lands historically occupied by the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Today, we're excited to be joined by Allison Corbett, co-director of Colibri Academy for HIV and Language Justice, and Laura Gonzales, director of Language Access Florida. Allison is a Brooklyn-based Spanish-English interpreter, language justice practitioner, and oral historian. Guided by the principles of language justice, she partners with institutions to transform their relationship to language and power and build their capacity for serving and engaging multilingual communities. Dr. Gonzales is a translator, researcher, and educator committed to fostering language justice in academic, professional, and community settings. She's an award-winning author of 4 books and more than 30 articles focused on the importance of language justice. To ask a question, you can enter it into the Q&A session at any time during the presentation. You'll see that on your bottom or top bar in Zoom. You can also use the Zoom reaction button. That will allow you to raise your hand at any time during the presentation. As you can see, we also have some in-person attendees, so we'll make sure to give them a chance to chime in as well. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our presenters.
Thank you so much, Samantha, for that introduction. Like Samantha mentioned, I'm Laura Gonzales, and I'm excited to be co-presenting with Allison today. One of the things we want to emphasize is that both of us have very extensive presentations, but we're not going to share everything with you today. We want this to be a very open dialogue. We want to learn a little bit about you, your context as well, and answer any questions that you have, not just at the end, but throughout the presentation. So please feel free, for those of you who are on Zoom, to type in the chat or to unmute. And those of you who are in the room, same thing, please feel free to ask us any questions throughout the presentation. We're going to share with you 2 different projects, but they're very connected in terms of our commitment to language justice. And then after, we'll just have a little bit of a dialogue to see what are the connections between our presentations. One of the things we want to emphasize is that both of us are in 2 very different contexts. And so one of the things we're showcasing is how we can hold on to and forefront language justice principles in very, very different contexts. So with that, I will go ahead and start sharing my screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. All right, so just a little outline of what we'll cover today. We'll do brief introductions. I know Samantha provided some context, but just give you a little bit more context about who we are. And then each of us will do a brief presentation providing an overview of projects we have worked on, just to sort of showcase our approaches to language justice across these different contexts. And then we'll have a synthesis conversation where Allison and I will react to each other's presentations, as well as incorporate any feedback that you might have. So please, again, do not limit the Q&A to the Q&A portion. If there's something that resonates with you, I'd love to hear about it in the chat. If there's something that you want to follow up on, I would love for you to unmute and just ask the question so that we can engage in dialogue throughout. I'll let Allison introduce herself first.
Hi, thank you so much, Laura, for starting us off, and to the Eval Cafe for having us. So I'm Allison Corbett. I use she, her pronouns. And yeah, so I'm a language justice consultant, Spanish English interpreter, and oral historian. I was born and raised in Virginia, but I've been in New York City for the past 10 years. And I really came to this work from a background as an interpreter, and with the significant privilege of learning Spanish as a second language, of not interpreting for my family growing up, but coming later to being an interpreter. And so throughout my over 15 years of interpreting experience as a medical interpreter, as a community interpreter, my experience witnessing how even sometimes when there are interpreters, when there's interpretation and translation provided, the big gaps in access and equity that still persists within institutions really led me to want to pursue more systems level work for language justice. And so that has involved working with municipalities. I'll be speaking about one of those projects today, other nonprofits, and I currently co-direct the Colibri Academy for HIV and Language Justice, where we work with organizations doing HIV/AIDS work to shift internal cultures towards language justice. And finally, I also write and do research about language justice, grounded in my background as an oral historian through a collaboration with a dear colleague called Circular. So I'm excited to hear more about you all and share more.
Yeah, so a little bit more about me. I am originally from Santa Cruz, Bolivia. My family and I moved to the US when I was about 9 years old. And I always joke that they picked Florida because the weather is the same. But then I went on to get my PhD and do my studies in Michigan, which is the complete opposite, as you all know. So that was a big culture shock for me, in addition to that experience of learning English as a second language, which completely transformed who I am, what I'm committed to, and what I decided to build my career around. I teach courses at the University of Florida around writing, multilingual writing, and user experience research. I also do user experience research for large-scale corporations. And during the pandemic, and this is some of the work I'll be sharing with you today, I started to notice such a deep need for user-centered translation, not just around Spanish and English, but also around indigenous languages from Latin America. So a lot of my work and the impetus for developing Language Access Florida as a consulting organization that helps to provide user-centered translation across multiple different languages, it all stems from the need that we saw in our community to evaluate what languages are even present in this rural part of Florida, and B, how we can best serve those multilingual community members. I'm currently living in Gainesville, Florida, which is very different from Orlando, Florida, where I grew up, and I'll be sharing a little bit more about that with you as I kind of take you through this project. So for me, and thinking about what aspects of my work would be relevant for the Evaluation Cafe, the big lesson that I've learned when doing language justice research is that researching language access or language justice means thinking beyond the majority. A lot of times when we try to do language access work and just focus on providing access, we think about the majority. What's the biggest population of multilingual speakers in this location? How do we evaluate the needs of that population? And what kind of services do we need to provide to the people who speak the language majority? So maybe not English, but what is the most popular language spoken besides English? But a language justice approach makes us think about who is not the majority? What languages are not deeply represented in our community? Who maybe is not represented because they don't feel comfortable filling out assessments and evaluations. They don't feel comfortable filling out the census because it's not safe for them to. Who feels comfortable participating in surveys and who doesn't? And how do we change and shift our evaluation methods to account for those voices that are often overlooked? Who's always included because they are the most represented, and who is excluded? Those are the big questions that have been guiding my language justice work in my local community and just in different communities that I've lived in. So to me, thinking about language justice means thinking beyond the reported demographics. And when it comes to people immigrating from Latin America, this is a huge topic that we see continuing to rise throughout the different iterations of the pandemic. When organizations in my local context in Gainesville, Florida, were developing materials to inform people about COVID-related protocols, and they noticed that people were coming from Latin America, the assumption was that these people speak Spanish. But that's just not the case, and that's not an appropriate assumption to make anymore, especially given the large and shifting migration patterns of indigenous communities from Latin America who do not speak Spanish or who might speak Spanish as a second, third, or fourth language. These communities speak multiple different language variants that are very much tied to their culture, very much tied to the places that they're from, very much tied to the environments that they lived in. And so with the increasing growth of migrants coming in from Latin America who do not speak Spanish, we need to sort of shift this perception about everybody from Latin America speaks Spanish. And we need to just really understand when we're developing, in this case, the case of this project, health-related messaging for communities from Latin America, what could that look like and how could we align with Indigenous values and Indigenous approaches to language as we develop these materials. A little bit about my context. So I am in North Central Florida in Gainesville. We're a large university town where people come to study from all over the world. And students who come to the university, they do speak English, but their families don't. Their families are in our grocery store. Their families were living through the pandemic with students, and their families have very many different language access needs. We also have a growing population of migrant farm workers, many of them who come from Latin America and speak multiple different languages, and many of whom do not feel comfortable filling out, traditional census surveys or other sorts of surveys that might be typically used. And so given this context and given this community, I started collaborating with health justice organizations in Gainesville throughout the pandemic to sort of figure out how can we learn about who's actually here? Because there's this assumption that A, it's rural North Central Florida, there's no diversity here, and that's false. And B, that any diversity that exists must be Spanish speaking because they're from Latin America, and that's also false. So a few collaborators and I started thinking about how we can learn about the perspectives and experiences of the people who are actually in our community. Throughout the pandemic, starting in 2020, through word of mouth, we found people to interview. So we asked different people at different community organizations, restaurants, health clinics, churches, to allow us to interview people who speak languages other than English in our community. And these are just some of the languages that we were able to learn about. So of course there was Spanish, but there's also Haitian Creole, Mandarin Chinese, Hindi, many indigenous languages such as Ahuateco, Acateco, Mam, Canjoval, several different languages that are not often represented in the numbers that are shared with us when we ask about who our multilingual communities are. So just by engaging in this interview, snowball sampling, word of mouth method, we were able to learn about different pockets of our community that are oftentimes isolated and excluded when it comes to health messaging. Another thing that we learned through this interview process is about the importance of always connecting conversations about language to conversations about race. So this is from an interview that we did with one of our community members who speaks Haitian Creole, French, and English. And she said, there's a racist belief circulating in the US that the Black population is only composed of African Americans. And this is definitely the case in Florida. This has in turn created the assumption that Black people only speak English, so they don't need access to language access services. Moreover, she said, due to Haiti's complex linguistic history composed of French and Haitian Creole, Haitians who migrate to the US are excluded from various activities. So by asking people to share their stories about language access, we were able to learn about how certain immigrants, and particularly Black immigrants, are not often included in conversations about language access because there's this assumption that they speak English, but that's just not the case. So again, pushing us to think about when we do outreach with multilingual communities, what falls under that multilingual community umbrella, and how can we really understand who all is encompassed, what their stories are, and what their approaches to accessing information might be. So the big lesson we continue to learn is that researching language access means assessing impact through different methods. So it's not just about figuring out who's here, but how do they access information? How does messaging need to change based on cultural values? We all know that multilingual communities might appreciate translation, but translation is just one piece of a bigger language justice puzzle. There are so many other things. It doesn't do anyone any service if you translate everything and still treat people in a dehumanizing way. So translation is just one piece of language justice. What is the outreach strategy that local organizations in our community are developing and employing when it comes to language justice? Many of our organizations said, we have access to a language access line. So, we do provide language access. And then my question is always, do people know that you have a language line? Do your employees know how to use that language line? When people come into your space speaking a language other than English, are they treated with respect and dignity? And again, how are we gathering community input? So are we gathering feedback on the effectiveness of that language line and how it's being used? Because there's different levels and different types of caliber when it comes to language line. So thinking about this holistic strategy when it comes to language access has been really critical to the work that I've been able to do so far. During the pandemic, another thing that we did as we were interviewing multilingual community members to learn about their needs was also learning from Indigenous language and language justice workers across the world. One of them is Abigail Castellanos Garcia, who's pictured here, and she really was able to explain what was happening when it came when it came to the pandemic and the information that was being shared. She said that since the start of the pandemic, there was so much information. So it was almost an information flood, right? And that information was continuing to change. Every day it was changing. But in rural areas, so something like Florida or something like rural parts of Mexico, which is what Abigail is talking about, there was a complete lack of information. There was disinformation, and we were left on our own to decipher how what the government was sharing was applicable to us. We saw this really happen in rural North Central Florida, where there was this constant messaging about social distancing without taking into account that many of our Indigenous migrant farm workers live in multi-family homes where social distancing is nearly impossible. So again, just thinking about how we can, evaluate what language needs there are, but B, how information needs to be not just translated, but also localized and tailored for different cultural values and just different lived realities. Our migrant farm worker community members would have loved to be able to social distance, but that just didn't fit within their reality. So we really had to research and figure out what sort of messaging we could provide for them to bring them peace and confidence, and also keep them safe. Another thing that we learned from our collaborators in Mexico is that the overall messaging related to COVID didn't exactly align with Indigenous values. So an interpreter and translator from Villa Diaz Ordaz in Mexico told us, her name is Edith, and she told us that this messaging that the state, so when I say the state, I mean either the Mexican state or the US state, these sanctioned organizations were providing, the messaging was often around an individualistic fear of death. So stay home so that you stay safe, stay home so that you do not die. But Edith said that contrary to Western ideas, our Indigenous communities know that our lives don't end at death. So telling people to not get sick because they will die, like the Mexican government is telling us, or like the US government was telling us here, that doesn't always work as well as telling people to say yes to life. The focus here is on having a better life in whatever form, rather than being guided by a fear of death. So again, it's a shift in the messaging and a shift in how we evaluate the effectiveness of messaging when it comes to communities from different cultural backgrounds. Another value here that is represented in the flyer you see is this intergenerational safety and community, right? So it's not about an individualistic fear of I'm going to die, but let's keep each other safe. Let's say yes to life so that we protect our elders and therefore protect our culture, protect our languages, protect our community and our environment. Another lesson that we learned as we were doing research and developing materials for Indigenous language speakers, many organizations told us, well, when you provide these translations into Indigenous languages about COVID, you don't need to have the written form. You don't need to do flyers. You could just need to do audios, because many Indigenous language speakers don't read their language, they just speak them. So there's no need to provide written materials of this information. And our partners told us that's absolutely not true. They said, you know, we have been erased from the written cultural record from every single cultural event that has happened in the world, because writing has historically and contemporarily been used to erase Indigenous people from the written record. So while people may not want to read the information in their Indigenous languages, it's important that yes, you share an audio file with them, but you also share the information in written form, so that when we look back on this terrible time in our world, we see that Indigenous people were here, that Indigenous people were writing and providing information for themselves, and that they were part of this massive event that happened. So one of the things one of our partners, Elena, said is that even though many people don't read or write in their Indigenous languages, I think it's important to make these writing systems visible, make them part of the cultural record. So this was hard, and it's still hard to make this point with organizations who are paying for the translation and who may not want to pay for a written document alongside an audio file. But what we tell them is that when you are actually embracing a language justice approach to providing information, you are also contributing or should be contributing to the activist work of the communities that you're trying to serve. So translating into Indigenous languages means or should mean that you also contribute to the language preservation efforts that the communities have always been forefronting. So that's another lesson that we learned through this project. I'm just going to show you a couple of the examples of what we ended up coming up with. These are two examples, one in Mixteco, number one, and one in Canjoval, number two, where you see that we transformed a lot of the information related to COVID into these very short fotonovelas, which were just like brief stories that describe what types of strategies people can use to keep themselves safer in the home. So although complete isolation may not be possible, you know, having people who are sick in your home in their own bedroom, if possible, bringing them their food, allowing them to have their own utensils for that period of time so that you're not using somebody else's utensils, specific strategies that people can use within the context of their actual lived experience, things that were actionable for them. We provided these alongside audios in these languages and share these out at different community fairs and different community events. So here you see people interacting with the brochures that were provided in different Indigenous languages, taking a look at them. These also became conversation pieces. So it wasn't just put a pile of flyers at the front of the event and let them go, but take them to people. And some of the things that people said were like, wow, you actually thought about Canconval? I haven't seen this before. What does it say? And so then you can engage in a conversation, of course, here in these cases in Spanish, about the importance of representation. And although these people may have understood Spanish to some degree, getting some personal information, like really important information in their preferred language, was really, really valuable and important and made them feel like they were part of the community and that the community had thought about them. This is an example from one community member who had just heard one of the audios we provided. And he said, this is the first time I've heard my language spoken outside my home since I got to the US. And he had been in the US for over 10 years. So again, language justice is not just about providing the information and saying everyone is welcome to access this information, but about engaging in dialogue and thinking about people who are often overlooked or discarded when it comes to health-related messaging. So these are just a couple of the examples. This is a picture that we took after providing interpretation into Canjoval for Maria, who was pregnant at the time. We provided interpretation into Canjoval during one of her first checkup appointments, prenatal appointments at our clinic. And although Maria can understand some Spanish, this was the first time that she was able to hear about her baby in her own voice, in her own language. And she said, I was happy to be able to understand when the doctor told me, look, there's your baby's feet, here are her arms. I felt close to my baby for the first time. So although Maria had had previous appointments in Spanish or in English where people just pointed to the screen and said, this is what's going on, she said this is the first time she felt close to her child because she was hearing about her child in her own language. So just to share some quick takeaways before I pass it over to Allison, it's really important to research the languages spoken in your community outside of the documented numbers. Although the numbers may seem small, every number is a person, and every person belongs to a family or a community, and all of those deserve representation when we're having conversations about sharing health-related information. And for many immigrants, including Indigenous language speakers, language access is much more than words. So it's representation, inclusion, it's being part of the community and being thought about when it comes to developing health-related messaging. And access to information requires training and cultural competency. Again, a lot of what we heard in our community and continue to hear is we do provide some translation, we have access to a language line, but I think it's really important for us to think about how we take that next step in terms of providing opportunities for our community to evaluate what our language access protocols are, to give feedback on types of translations they would like, and to really engage with us in two-way communication about what language justice could mean. So I'll leave it with that and pass it over to Allison.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm going to get my screen share set up. All right. All right. Can you see my screen? Looks like maybe it's loading. Great. Yeah, so like Laura mentioned, we have very different projects that we're sharing about, but are approaching them with similar principles and values. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of the other side of the coin, what it looks like to do larger scale multilingual survey research. So kind of these big formal processes that we use to actually create some of the demographic data that can oftentimes be so problematic in terms of really representing speakers of non-English languages and linguistic needs and realities. So just before I get too much further, I just want to make it clear that I'm here in my own personal, independent, professional capacity, and not as a representative of the city of New York. Though I'll be talking about a project that I worked on with the Center for Research on Home, Housing Opportunity, Mobility, and Equity that is housed within the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. This presentation is mine and mine alone, and does not necessarily represent those entities. So I worked on the New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey, like I mentioned, which is carried out, sponsored by the Center for Research on Home in New York City, and served as the language access manager for their 2021 rollout of the survey. And just to ground first in how I frame language justice and understand language justice as an ever-evolving framework and set of practices that ensure that people can lead, speak, and participate fully in both movement building and in their communities, regardless of the languages or the linguistic variants that they speak. And so language justice really takes tools like interpretation and translation and pairs them with an analysis of how power operates through language to create multilingual spaces and to decenter the dominance of English. And so while providing access through interpretation and translation can be really important and life-saving in some cases, language justice asks us to be more willing to redesign and rethink our systems, our methodologies, and how we operate with multilingual communities in mind from the start, rather than as sort of an add-on to processes and systems that were really designed in English and for English speakers. So I'm going to share about the New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey, NYCHVS for short, as kind of a case study of taking a holistic approach, a language justice informed approach to survey research. So the NYCHVS is a citywide representative survey of New York City's housing stock and population. It's fielded about every 3 years, sponsored by the City of New York, but the U.S. Census Bureau carries out the fielding of the survey. And it is one of the oldest housing surveys in the country since 1965. And the data produced from the official vacancy rate, or the survey produces the official vacancy rate for New York, which is part of how local and state rent regulation gets defined. So this data is used by policymakers as well as researchers and other community advocates. It is a survey done with a representative sample pool. So in 2021, the sample was 12,000 housing units, and the interview is conducted in person verbally, not through writing. A census field representative conducts a 30-minute interview with one knowledgeable adult resident of the unit, or if it's a vacant unit, somebody knowledgeable like a super or neighbor who can speak about the vacant unit. And until 2017, the survey was only formally conducted in English. And then in 2017, for the first time, there was a translation of the survey instrument into Spanish. And so, of course, you know, New Yorkers speak many languages. And so we know, as is often the practice, not just by census, but in a lot of other large-scale survey research, languages other than English and interviews conducted in English are often just entrusted to field representatives to, on the fly, individually create their own translations. And so that's why we specify formally conducted, right? And so in 2021, using the experience and learning from doing the Spanish translation of the instrument, and also with a greater priority on equity and inclusion for all New Yorkers in the survey was redesigned. And so representation and inclusion, as well as ensuring high quality data, was really the goal. And so creating a multilingual survey was part of that, but it also went beyond that in thinking about accessibility of the process for New Yorkers. And so the approach to creating a multilingual survey for the NYC HVS was really three-pronged. So the first piece was to do advanced translation of the survey across 7 languages, which I'll speak about a little bit more in a moment. And then partnering with a design firm to create multilingual materials. Again, not materials designed in English and then translated, but designed from the beginning to be multilingual. All the kind of collateral that respondents receive. So from advanced mailing, that's kind of the outreach that selected units receive, all the way through the closeout of the interview process. These materials were multilingual. And then finally, comprehensive training, which is really the biggest role that I played, was providing comprehensive training for all field representatives that was centered on supporting the participation of speakers of languages other than English. And so I'll just briefly touch on these 3 components of the approach. So, I think I skipped one. Yeah. So advanced translation is a specific process of translation that has been used by the European Social Survey since I believe 2010. So the way that plays out across multiple European countries is, of course, a little bit different than the way we adapted the approach, the way HPD, the survey sponsors, adapted the approach for local use in one city with speakers from many different regions. So the questionnaire was translated using this process into these languages: Spanish, Russian, Bengali, Haitian Creole, traditional Chinese, and simplified Chinese. And these languages were selected specifically to address not just languages and their prevalence spoken in New York, according to some of these admittedly quite flawed demographic resources, but also considering specifically linguistic isolation of different language communities. So these were selected to be able to reach 98% of linguistically isolated households in New York City. And linguistically isolated household refers to a household where there are few to no ties with English speakers, right? So there may be communities or households where everybody speaks a language other than English, or multiple languages other than English, but there are a lot of ties to other people in the community, other family members, et cetera, who could help provide access. And really, looking at this kind of large scale survey, large scale population, and how to best reach the majority of New Yorkers. And so the approach of advanced translation really is about a collaboration between local translators and the survey researchers who design the what we would call the source survey in English. And so local translators work together to review the source survey in English and flag terms, phrases, concepts that might not translate well, other things that might serve as potential barriers in creating a translation of the survey. So things like the length of questions or complicated grammatical structures that would be difficult to translate, culturally specific questions that might be difficult to understand and need more context for speakers of languages other than English. And so this kind of back and forth happens multiple times in what we call consensus meetings, right? Where then the survey sponsors go back, take the feedback, and adjust the source material in English to better provide an ease for translation. And oftentimes, really, it resulted in strengthening the English instrument as well. Not only did it improve the translations that were produced, but also made for clearer, more direct, and oftentimes easier to understand, even for English speakers, content of the survey. And so there were significant changes that were made as a result of these consensus meetings, which sometimes took place just with translators in a specific language, or oftentimes could take place with multiple sets of translators for multiple languages. So they could be in conversation flagging, for our language, this is kind of complicated. For us, there's this, and then that conversation could be had simultaneously about what would work best across all of those languages in this consensus process. And just one example, but that had like a pretty big effect, was the term unit, which you've already heard me use. In English, the survey tended to use in the past the word unit to refer to the place where somebody lived, instead of saying house or apartment, because of course there are many different kinds of housing units. But with feedback from the translation team, they learned that in multiple languages, that did not work as this catch-all neutral term as it was supposed to work in English. And so instead, the way the team dealt with this was to actually ask at the very beginning of the interview the respondent, how do you identify the place what do you call the place where you live? Is it an apartment? Is it a house? And then it would auto-populate from there with the correct word to get away from having to use this catch-all term. Instead, they could be more specific, which resulted in more clarity for respondents. And so, of course, translation, as I'm echoing what Laura also said, right? Translation is a really key, important piece, but it's never the only piece, and it oftentimes is not sufficient on its own to really ensure equity and access. So here are just a few of the examples of the multilingual materials that were produced: the language card, this "Sorry I Missed You" card, which was left blank to accommodate language in any direction of any kind of script. And then the brochure on the left you see is kind of the main informational brochure. And it was really important to have this kind of like linguistic parity of all languages up front. And really the survey treated all of these as 7 core languages versus the languages that were translated into. These are the languages the survey is officially fielded in. And so finally, training. The training, as I mentioned, was really about making sure there was a shared understanding that language justice and linguistic inclusion for the survey was the responsibility of all field representatives. And this was something learned from the experience in 2017, right? Training is needed not only for bilingual field representatives who are going to use the new translated instrument, it's also for anybody, whether they're bilingual, multilingual, or monolingual English speakers, who comes across a respondent who they don't share a language with. So the protocol, because you don't know who you're going to encounter. You don't know the language of the household before you get there, though of course there can be some, predictions. You won't know until you get there. And so the protocol is to then connect respondents with field representatives who speak their language, so that the interview can be conducted directly in their language. And so this required also buy-in and understanding from all of the field representatives that this process mattered, that it was really important, not only for inclusion, but also for reliable and high quality data, that respondents and New Yorkers were able to do this interview in their preferred language in which they can express themselves most clearly. And so the goals of training were really to reduce this reliance on, okay, this is the English speaker in the household, so this is who we'll end up interviewing. They must be the best respondent, or attempts to, pull in another person to interpret or to muddle through interviews with insufficient language skills, and also to provide support not only for bilingual field representatives using the translated survey, but also for the field representatives. Many field representatives who use the official translation also spoke other languages and were therefore also called upon, for that other percentage of language speakers outside of those 7 languages to do that on the fly translation. But we wanted to provide them with a little bit more guidance on how to prepare for that, how to do that self-translation in a way that would improve consistency and comparability of the data that's collected. And so, again, there's much more that can be shared about this process. I can share a link to an article about it, but really the key takeaways for this project was about, again, translation can be the most visible, most tangible step, and it can require a huge and important investment, right, of resources, but that alone is not enough. So any multilingual effort for research, evaluation, survey research must be intentional by design from the start, and also has to be supported and reinforced at every step of the way through training and through operations of the survey. And just to to close things up, in terms of really thinking about, okay, we addressed how data is collected and representation and accuracy in representing such a multilingual city. But the importance is also thinking about the next steps, right? The next steps are addressing accessibility and usability of research findings and data. And so not only who's represented, but who can use this data, who has access to data about their own community, right? And a lot of times that is not produced in languages other than English. So that's kind of next for the Center for Research on Home, is really thinking about how to start publishing data findings in non-English languages, and how to prioritize reaching marginalized communities so that they can access, use, and are aware of the data that exists that can be used in their own advocacy efforts. And so I will stop there. I'll share the link to the article. This is the name of the article, and would love to stay in touch. Here's my information if you have questions or would like to talk some more about this.
Thank you so much. And I invite anybody to, raise your hand in the reactions, come off mute if you have questions. You can also drop them into the chat or the Q&A. Okay, yes, Sonia.
Hi, Allison and Laura, thank you so much for your work. So detailed and persistent and necessary. I'm really excited to obviously continue conversation. I'm curious about one thing. Laura, we haven't met before, so I'm going to ask you a question. I'm curious about those events, those community events that you were doing this outreach at. And I saw in the chat that you said it was an event where community members could get IDs, which is great. And it reminded me of a outreach program that happened in the Twin Cities in the 90s, where community legal services and judges would go out to farm working communities to get to know people, but also to recruit interpreters, to sort of identify community members who were bilingual or maybe had some bilingual skills, or, you know, could potentially down the road be interested in this kind of career, maybe teenagers. And, you know, it continues to be an ongoing problem, as you know, creating that pipeline. It's something that, you know, I deal with a lot in my work, and I'm wondering if you think that this is something that could fold into some of the work that you do. And I know that's a big question. Maybe we can keep talking about it, but it might have been something that you've already thought about a lot or already worked on, but didn't get time to talk about in your presentation. So just wanted to put that out there.
Oh, well, first of all, Sonia, it's nice to meet you. I would love to stay in contact. So you're asking about recruiting for interpreters and if that's part of the work that we do?
Or translators, yeah, if there's sort of, if that's part of any conversations that you have at these kind of outreach events. Yes.
Yes, so it's definitely a challenge for us as well, because a lot of the translators, so most of the translators and interpreters that I work with here in Florida are actually in Guatemala or in Mexico because of that identical issue. And also because I work with organizations in Guatemala and Mexico who provide training in translation and interpretation for Indigenous language speakers. So like we kind of have this network of people. At the same time, one of the things that we've been working on here is to provide that translation and interpretation training alongside other organizations on multiple levels. Like on the one hand, because we still struggle with agencies in our local context not believing there's a need for language access, so we train them on that, and then have done some training in terms of providing training to Indigenous language speakers who are interested. It's just so hard because they also have full-time jobs and don't necessarily see translation or interpretation as a viable career choice because it is so underpaid, generally speaking. So one way that we've started to kind of make some move in this direction is to provide stipends to Indigenous language speakers in our community as health promotores, like promoters, not just to do the translation, but to review the translation that's done by the people in Mexico and Guatemala, because that takes less time for them to review it, but specifically ask them to share through WhatsApp groups and like text groups and social media groups to share that information with other speakers of that language in the community. And that has been like one very small step, I think, in the right direction of being like, this is actually a profession, and hey, you do have skills in this. And also you can help make sure that the work actually lands with the audience. So we haven't done any formal training programs, but we have recruited people to be the health promoters to help us just share out the messaging, because if we're spending resources and time and stuff developing them, we want to make sure that people reach that people access information. So roundabout answer to your question, I would love to talk more.
No, that's a great question. And I would say that's much more than a tiny step. I think that's a huge step. So again, thank you so much. And yes, we can be in touch.
Yes, thank you.
And there was a question in the Q&A section. So the question is, how did folks doing data collection coordinate with respondents and colleagues to coordinate data collection in preferred language?
Sorry, I'm trying to access the question. Okay.
And I can pitch in, it was my question too, just to help clarify, just because my team we field kind of an adult health survey. And so we started doing some in-person data collection. And so I think oftentimes, you know, we kind of have gone the route of sort of maybe picking the best respondent as the English speaking respondent, right? And so, you know, how did, you know, you talked about having a process and, you know, working on coordinating with colleagues to set up that opportunity maybe for the collection to be done in the preferred language. And so I was just wondering kind of how did that get coordinated and communicated to folks, especially when you're like overcoming maybe that language barrier as well. So I guess any kind of further insight on that would be really helpful.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. I can definitely respond to that. And I think you're right, the coordination is a huge piece, right? And is part of the like all the people involved with coordination and supervisors and everything also have to be on board with like, this is important. We have to get people connected, reinforcing, right, for the field representatives that they should be referring. So as I mentioned, the process for the NYC HVS was sharing, referring. But so first there was training for the field representatives on how to use a language card to identify speakers of, try to be as specific as possible and really encourage people to not like make assumptions, but to actually take the time to use the language card to figure out what language a respondent spoke. And we also did scenarios of like how to determine, and how to also just go against, there's such, I think, and actually I see there's another question in the chat about on the fly translation. So on like, there are so many instances in our culture and institutions where there isn't access. And so a lot of times bilingual people are also used to stepping in and providing bridge of support. And so it's not to devalue those efforts of making those connections, of the ways that people have had to step in and support family members or neighbors or whoever, but is also about trying to figure out, so like, if somebody, we had a scenario, for example, that's like an older person who answers the door, maybe, who speaks Bengali only, and there's like a young nephew who's living there who's like, oh, I'll take care of it, like you don't even need to worry about it. But really emphasizing, actually make sure, does that person should know, even using that third person interpreter, this is what we're doing, here's what we want to know. And also making sure to do some of that pre-work of like, okay, ask the person how long they've been there, get a sense, are they actually the person who's like been the longtime leaseholder, or who really knows about kind of what are all the things that are, it's a pretty comprehensive survey, so all the details that are going to be asking about, figuring out if there is another English speaker there, doing your best to figure out who should be interviewed, and sharing that there are resources, and they'll follow up with somebody who is able to interview them in that language, and that's not a problem. They'll just do follow up. And so that's presuming there's an English speaker there, which sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. Otherwise, leaving a brochure, doing the language identification to the best of their abilities, leaving a brochure in that language, and then contacting a coordinator to let them know, okay, this person should be contacted by this, but in this language, and then a bilingual field representative would follow up, right? And we also emphasized for the field representatives making first contact that also not trying to do too much and muddle through is also a way of not creating sort of like negative rapport, because if you're kind of wasting somebody's time trying to muddle through, you can't communicate, you're trying to do this survey, and then somebody has to kind of go and do damage control after you tried for 30 minutes to unsuccessfully do an interview, like you're doing a disservice. And if I can also say, it's just like one more word on this question from Michael in the chat. Yeah, and again, not to devalue, but specifically for survey, there's such a careful process in which survey questions are worded to get at a specific, this is what we want to know, so we're asking it in this kind of way. The translations are produced in a similarly careful kind of way. And in terms of comparability of data and accurate representation, having on the fly translation, means you have the questions being fielded in different ways, like 57 different times in Spanish, using different wording, which may give a different impression which may lead to a different answer. And so just really for accuracy and consistency and comparability, I would say that's like one of the big pieces, which is also about equity, right? Because if you can't have accurate data representing communities, it's not equitable representation.
And thank you for that. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm probably not the only person that's disappointed. I want to thank you both for your wonderful presentation and for joining us today. And I also just put the link to join our mailing list for Eval Cafe in the chat. You can stay in the loop on any of our remaining presentations for the fall. We also have some exciting spring presentations coming up. Our next Eval Cafe will be November 15th, featuring Emily Gates, and her presentation is titled Criteria Are the Heart of Evaluation, or Are They? So she's going to leave us on a cliffhanger there until November 15th. So again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for all of your participation today from the audience. And we hope to see you at a future Eval Cafe.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.